With Joe Coburn and guests.
It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Today I'm announcing the biggest strengthening of our national defence for a generation.
The UK defence industry on a war footing. Rishi Sunak announces a big increase in defence spending. 5 die in the Channel. The government hopes its Rwanda scheme will stop the boats. We'll hear from a former Home Secretary who thinks ID cards are the answer.
We have a bill, it's gone through its stages in the House of Commons, and that bill does a number of things to help people in the private rented sector, including ending no-fault evictions.
That was February. Is the Housing Secretary about to break that promise? Also today, the government's dementia advisor resigns after tens of thousands of people who care for relatives are forced to hand back benefit payments.
It made me sick to my stomach. That's a huge amount to have to pay back, especially when you are looking after somebody who's disabled.
Joining us today, Conservative MP Miriam Cates, Labour peer David Blunkett, journalist and author Grace Blakeley, and the editor-in-chief of Unheard, Freddie Sayers. This is Politics Live. Let's start with the issue of defence and defence spending in particular. It has absolutely moved up the political agenda. The front page here of the Daily Mail, biggest boost for defence in a generation. And this is the front page of The Guardian, covering the Prime Minister's trip first to Poland, to Warsaw and then to Berlin. Prime Minister to raise defence spending and put arms industry on what he called a war footing. And there's the image of Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, on the plane, surrounded by lobby journalists, following him to Berlin, where he's meeting and has met the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. My question to sort of open the programme, starting with you, Miriam, is do you feel safer or more fearful today than yesterday?
I think increasing defence spending definitely makes the UK safer in the long term. Obviously, it takes a while to ramp up that spending in terms of what we're actually going to procure and how we're going to spend it. But I think it's absolutely the right decision to increase spending on UK defence.
Do you feel safer or more fearful? Because, David, people listening to the sort of language around these increases and announcements in defence spending and the dangerous world we're living in, what impact do you think it'll have?
Well, I feel exactly the same today as I did yesterday, but I do know, and maybe not all the viewers do, that Boris Johnson announced this 2 years ago, and that the war footing is about backfilling on all the armaments that we're quite rightly sending to Ukraine. So you have to actually get the industry to produce the goods. My main concern on defence is not the commitment to 2030 and 2.5% of GDP, although it depends what GDP is like at the time, which makes a big difference, but actually what kind of war armaments we're talking about, because we're going to be in an entirely different world. We've seen that with the drones, haven't we? Producing things that were relevant for the Second World War is absolutely useless.
Yeah, and it does take time, it seems, to procure the right sort of defence ammunition and artillery and equipment. I mean, David is right, Grace. This was something that was announced, this ambition to get to 2.5% of national income being spent on defence. It has been just under 2.3%. But with all this focus on defence, do we now feel safer or more fearful?
Look, it would have been better to spend that money from a national security perspective on things like investing in decarbonisation. And this is not just something coming from a kind of lefty-lovey snowflake. This is a point that has been made by the Ministry of Defence, by generals in the US, that climate breakdown is one of the single biggest threats to our security as individual nations and as a world. That's not even mentioning the fact that Putin is literally being funded from revenues from fossil fuels, not to mention other countries that we treat as allies, like Saudi Arabia, which is an incredibly autocratic regime. And which, is sold weapons and is funded through oil revenue. So if we want to move to a safer world, one that is free of autocratic dictators funded by fossil fuels, and one in which we're prepared for what will inevitably be a massive change in refugee flows and all those sorts of things because of climate breakdown.
If our adversaries are funded through fossil fuels, how does it make us safer to abandon them?
What I'm saying is that if we want to build a safer world, it's not enough simply to respond to threats as they arise. We have to actually invest in creating that safer world. And what I was saying was that if we had invested that money in decarbonisation a long time ago, Putin would have been a lot weaker when this war started.
I think we need to put the number into context. 2.5% brings us back to 2010. It was over 5% in the 1980s. So it makes the front pages, and it seems like a lot, but my suspicion is it's just the beginning, because once the reality of the next American presidential administration starts to kick home, Europe needs to work out how to defend itself. And I don't think we've even begun to realise the cost and the hard choices that is going to entail.
Right. I mean, I suppose that has been the ending of the peace dividend, as we discussed on the programme yesterday, and that has taken some time to recognise as more has been spent on public services like health. Let's talk about the small boats, the Rwanda bill, because it was finally passed. But yesterday, in the wake of that bill passing through both Houses of Parliament, 5 people, including a 7-year-old girl, died yesterday while trying to cross the English Channel on a small boat. They were trying to get to the UK on this boat, which was carrying over 100 migrants or people seeking asylum. Here is a clip from a report that was done by my colleague, the correspondent Andrew Harding, on last night's News at 10. Let's take a look.
We are running with the police as they try to intercept a group of, it looks like 60 or 70 migrants.
And now things turn violent. Fireworks thrown at the police. Several young men pulling out crude weapons.
They're trying to protect the migrants as they head towards the sea to stop the police from stopping them.
And it works. A few stragglers are left behind, but the boat is allowed to move out towards open water. Look at the child on someone's shoulders on the right. Could the French police have done more to stop this?
Miriam, could they have done more, looking at those pictures?
Well, it's difficult to know whether they could have done more just looking at that, but I think it just illustrates what a deeply evil trade this people smuggling is, and the fact that those people have paid thousands of euros to criminals across Europe who are trying to smuggle them across to the UK. I mean, it's a shocking trade. It's dangerous, it's wrong, it's exploitative. That's why the government is trying everything to stop it.
Yeah, we've also paid, as a country, or the government's paid £481 million to the French for the police to stop what we saw there happening. Has that been money well spent?
Well, as I understand it, there have been improvements, although, as we've seen, it's completely not foolproof, and that's why I think realistically a deterrent is the only option. You've got to drastically reduce the number of people trying to make that journey, not just try to prevent those from setting off on the shore. But look, the whole thing is dreadful. It's shocking. It's obviously a huge tragedy that those people have died, including a child. But I think it just shows how important it is that we've got to stop this trafficking.
It's complicated. You can't make a conclusive sort of decision from that piece or those pictures, David, but I think a lot of viewers will think they could have intervened a bit more, the police. They could have stopped that boat getting into the water.
Well, I gather there were 12 police officers on the spot. I think the biggest problem that we've got with this is the boats reaching the coast. So part of that 500 million that you've talked about might actually go into licensing boats, so that actually there could be intervention by the police and security services in France much earlier, so that if you couldn't own a boat, if you couldn't actually sell a boat and you couldn't actually transport a boat without a licence, they'd be able to intervene. They can't until they launch them from the beach. It's a ridiculous situation, and I'm sure we could reach that kind of agreement. Would be a lot better than punishing the people who are trying to get across the channel.
What did you make of it when you saw those pictures yesterday?
I think if you watch those pictures, it looks very obvious that the French police could have done more. And every time something like that happens and the mainstream parties, both Tories and Labour, kind of gloss over it and talk in diplomatic speak, up pops Nigel Farage. There he was again this morning, putting a video on social media saying what an outrage it is and how we should force the French to actually stop this happening. And he will gain more percentages in the polls. So I think the wise thing would be not to tiptoe around it, but to really demand more from our French allies and actually try to physically stop them taking off.
I mean, they do say, the French police, that they stop a lot of boats, and the ones that come across are the ones that get away, to put it that way. But what did you make of it when you saw
Well, I mean, it's horrendous, isn't it, looking at those images, because these are human beings. You know, they're human beings who have put their lives at risk, looking often for a better life.
Should we be tougher with the French in the way Freddie said?
Well, look, I think once it's gotten to that point, it's already too late, isn't it? There are so many factors pushing people from their homes now. We've already mentioned climate change, but now we're in this horrendously unstable geopolitical scenario. This is going to be happening more. And if we aren't investing in, yes, you know, facilitating cooperation amongst all these different allies to make sure that this issue is spread, but also in dealing with those problems at home to make sure people aren't pushed out of their homes, then it's only going to get worse. You can't just put up walls around your little island as the world kind of implodes. You need to try and fix those problems.
Right. I mean, Miriam, obviously a supporter of the Rwanda bill, saying it's a deterrent, or it will be a deterrent if flights actually happen. There are other ideas, though. The Daily Telegraph has this headline: reinstate ID cards to tackle small boats crisis. Blunkett, David Blunkett, our guest here, urges Keir Starmer. Why do you think that will tackle the small boats crisis, David?
Because we would avoid what everybody understands as modern slavery. What's going to happen, regrettably, in the period before this is sorted out, is that people are going to be told by the smugglers, by the traffickers, that they just get to the coast and they'll give them a telephone number, and when they ring it, they'll be promised somewhere to sleep and a job, and they'll disappear into the sub-economy. And the only way we can deal with that is if we have a proper identity system, which incidentally would also avoid the massive increase in identity fraud. With modern technology, people would have it on their smartphone. We'd link it to the passport, so you gave no more information than you give for your passport. And in the end, I think people would just accept that this is the only way forward. We give more information to the private sector than we've ever given in our history, and people don't blink. Why not have a system that would actually deal with the traffickers and the organised criminals and those capturing people, because that's what they're going to be doing. In fact, that's what they're doing already.
I mean, is it an idea whose time has come?
I mean, Italy has ID cards, doesn't stop people coming in droves on boats to land on their shores. I think it's quite a stretch to think that ID cards is going to stop the small boats coming. And what you do once you introduce them, I believe, is you make a major philosophical leap, which is that instead of the government having to justify its existence to us, we have to justify our existence to the government, and you have to walk around with your papers, and it will be connected. It will be connected to all of the increasingly centralised technologies, and people, I think, are very rightly anxious about that.
So, do you have a passport?
I do. I don't carry it around.
Yeah. So, what would be wrong with you having on your smartphone an indication of exactly the same information that you happen to give? What would be wrong with that?
I think the problem is that there's always, with these kind of neutral-sounding technocratic policy solution, unintended consequences. And it reminds me of, I wrote about this in my book, the case of Michael Braithwaite, one of the victims of the Windrush scandals, who was a special needs teacher. He was, very, very good at his job in a difficult area. And one day he was brought into an office and said, "You need to present a biometric ID to show that you have the right to work in the UK." And he said, "I don't have that."
Exactly.
And there was back and forth between him and the Home Office saying, "Do you need this? Don't you need this?"
Is that an argument for ID cards or against them?
Well, what it is that it shows that these technologies can be used by the state to achieve other policy ends in a very political way.
He would have had a biometric ID.
But what if he hadn't? What if this is something that he never got around to getting? There's lots of people who don't have passports because they're expensive, because they don't know how to apply.
Simply give everyone a passport. Over 80% of adults have a passport
and then it
already.
becomes used as a disciplining tool to allow the state to get control over people's lives.
I think that is a very reasonable argument. And when people say, when people ridicule those who fear state overreach, I get very worried, because we know from what happened in COVID, not just here but around the world, that actually there is a temptation for the state to overreach whenever that facility is there. And I think the difference between us giving away our data to the likes of Amazon and Google, which I'm equally nervous about, and David they do, and I think the government should do much more to regulate those companies, but there is a difference between that and the government having everybody's details on some single central register that then could be in the future used for malign purposes. And I think it's already illegal to work here if you don't have the right status. The Home Office already takes biometric data from everybody who arrives here illegally and everybody who claims a visa legally. So it is absolutely possible for immigration enforcement to turn up at an employer and find out whether those people have the right status to work. And if they don't, the employer is fined £45,000.
But do they?
Yes.
They?
So
are there that many cases of that happening? Because the French complain endlessly that it is because that isn't enforced.
So the Home Office have massively stepped up enforcement. Last year there was a 68% increase.
Yeah, I think it was from 10 to 18.
But it's heading in the right direction. But the point is, even if you introduced identity cards, if you are determined to slip into the black market, what difference would this make? Whether or not you've got an identity card?
Well, let David defend the policy, and I'll come back to you, Freddie.
Well, quite simply, when you're accessing any free service, or you're actually presenting your identity as to whom you are, you need to be able to do that with some evidence. And all I'm suggesting is that would be a good way of having the evidence.
But we already do
I
that.
think
You need a national insurance number or an
also
NHS number for those purposes.
Ask the question about Tony Blair's involvement in all this. A lot of this is being pushed by the Tony Blair Institute, a vast organisation with 800 plus employees, $100 million of revenue. And when you read their policies, it connects ID cards with health passports, with ideas for banking and currency centralisation. And it's not conspiratorial or out there to worry that if you walk around with a single government ID that has every step you do attached to it, that is a serious change in our freedom.
It's very interesting to be on a programme with three of you who in very different ways, from far left to far right, are libertarians.
Well, because people value their freedom.
Well, of course.
David, you were a libertarian during COVID, and we spoke about lockdowns.
We live in a free society. If we didn't live in a free society because we'd voted in a fascist government, then of course it would be irrelevant whether we had this information or not, because they would impose it.
We very nearly had vaccine passports in this country. The Canadian government shut down bank accounts of people who protested against government policy.
It was your government.
It's always, and I opposed it with you, I think. But the point is, it's easy to think, sitting here in liberal democracy that seems very stable in many ways, to think that could never happen here. But I just don't think that's true. And the only time to future-proof our freedoms is now, isn't it? And to stop these things from happening now.
But it is interesting that the three of you are all very resistant to the idea when so many people do give their data and information and have everything on their smartphones. You don't think it would be popular?
I think we spoke, David and I did an interview during the COVID lockdowns, and he had a very different view on that. Suddenly, you did have a strong civil liberties.
Yeah,
it's quite. I can't really understand how you sit here and say, what example has there ever been of civil liberties being thrown away? It was 3 years ago.
Because of being ordered about in the way that emerged during the COVID crisis, in terms of people literally being locked in their homes, was too much for me. And I've never been a libertarian, but that was a step too far. And I just thought we needed common sense.
But that is the point, isn't it? It's that these things are introduced and then there's a kind of steady erosion. And what is presented as a kind of neutral, technocratic policy solution ultimately ends up being used in ways that are very political.
All right.
We never do
There's
anything.
a current example of that.
Does Keir Starmer like your idea, by the way?
I haven't heard from him on it.
But you have talked to him about it.
I've raised it.
Yes.
But, people are naturally concerned. My issue was to have a proper debate about it, not that it should have automatically become my party's policy, but that we explored the issues. And if we're afraid of taking any steps like this, we'd go massively backwards. We wouldn't have ANPR on our cars. We wouldn't have the kind of checks that we have at borders. We just wouldn't do anything, would we? We wouldn't have a passport.
Do you think they'll happen? My guess is we'll get ID cards under a Labour government.
I think we might get ID cards in the next 15 years. I'm not holding my breath.
All right, well, while you don't hold your breath, or hold your... No, don't hold your breath. Let's have this headline in the Daily Telegraph on a different issue. Rishi Sunak vows to end Britain's sick note culture. We've spoken about this quite a lot on the programme. Prime Minister also set to strip GPs of power to sign people off work under new plans. And it is a story from last week that the Prime Minister wants to review the whole fit note system to stop people being written off as not fit to work. Let me just read you this quote. There is a big problem with the way doctors grant sick notes. Once people are put on the sick, they tend to stay sick. We've got to persuade GPs it is in the interest of the patient and not just in the interests of the state or its agencies to help them. Who said that, David?
Probably me.
I think it was. That was a good guess. It was a good guess. It's from an article in The Guardian that you wrote in 2005. So you agree with Rishi Sunak, is the point?
I agree, not with the solution, but with the problem. There is a massive problem. We've got 850,000 16 to 25-year-olds not in education, employment or training. We've got 2.8 million people who are inactive, who are of so-called working age. Whatever these days that might mean, and we've got to do something sensible. But I ought to declare an interest. My wife is now a retired GP, and she was as tough as anyone would have been in terms of people who were, in the jargon up north, slinging the lead. Right. So, you know, we know all about getting tough. What we need is to be able to have a holistic approach. GPs have to diagnose people. They can't be told, we've just done this, haven't we, with Rwanda. We can't pass a law that says GPs can't diagnose people as being genuinely sick. What we've then got to do is to say, what is the pathway out of that? What can we do in terms of a national occupational health programme, helping people with their mental health issues, and in the end, persuading them and persuading employers that the best way out of all of this is to get a job.
The issue is that we are a sicker and a poorer society than we were, you know, just a decade, 15 years ago. And that is because of the astonishing cuts that have been imposed, not just across the health system, but also across social care, children's social care, the public health system, which is supposed to be involved in preventing a lot of these things from emerging. Also, if you speak to disability activists, we're hearing from that at the top of the programme, the way in which they're subjected to these horrendously humiliating assessments to determine whether or not they're fit for work. All of this has created a culture in which care is denigrated, and in which everyone is expected to go out and kind of fight in this competitive market system, even if they're ill, even if they're sick. And there's no institutions and resources, whether that's in the community or provided by the state, that support people to get better. That's the problem.
If you look at the charts of when this really spiked, it was during the lockdown years.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have never come back since then. So it's not quite right that it was to do with the funding changes.
It was, because this has been an issue that's been happening for a long time. Mental ill health, for example, particularly among young people, has been going up a lot recently.
Today, it would maybe be appropriate to mention Frank Field, the late Frank Field, in this context, a wonderful Labour MP and peer who sadly died. He spent his whole life campaigning on this issue, really, and trying to alleviate poverty by helping people out of it, not letting people letting people be stuck in inactivity. That's not kind. And actually, I think when we read the headlines today about, you know, Rishi Sunak says that you can't get a sick note from the doctor, it's very easy to present that as an unkind action. But really, if we want to be kind, we need to help people to get back into the mainstream of life. Don't leave them there. But you're talking about all stick
and no carrot. You're saying we're helping people get out of work by basically, you know, forcing them to continue working when they're ill without providing the services they need to get better.
But for many mental health problems, actually, one of the best things to do is to be in work, in a routine, around people. Not everybody, of course. And I think what the Prime Minister is highlighting, and I completely agree, is actually the shocking part of these statistics is, as you say, the number of young people signed off work for mental health reasons. That's where the major increases come. And I don't think it's correct to say that those are economic conditions, because why wouldn't they apply to the whole age range? It's the 20s and 30s where we've seen the shocking increase. And I think it's time to consider the impact of social media and living life online, because there's some very clear evidence coming out now about the impact on young people's mental health of growing up online and using social media.
Well,
obviously, that's just let me finish, Grace. Obviously, that's the generation that's affected. And the work of the US psychologist Jonathan Haidt really digs into this and looks at how we've overprotected children and young people in the real world and underprotected them online. And it's actually not a compassionate thing to say to a young person, do you know what? Languish on benefits, stay on social media,
of course
in the dark, actually get back to work, let's help you to do that.
We need to provide care, right?
Well,
and how do we think about providing care? The
reason
reason people's mental health is so bad, and the reason that it comes through a lot on social media, is because of this really individualistic society that we have, right? Whereas this was not just, it does exacerbate that. But if we think about how we rebuild society, you know, this was a Conservative agenda, the big society. How do we actually create care in the community? How to create institutions for young people in the community? Places that make people feel less alone. Because at the moment there is this sense that you're on your own. You're on your own when it comes to your job. You're, you know, stuck in a house you can barely afford. There's no real route out for you, and online is an escape. So how do we fix those wider conditions?
You're not going to rebuild the big society by this medicalisation of everything. So if people feel like the numbers for depression and ADHD and all of these have gone through the roof, and a lot of people feel if they don't feel right, it must be a medical thing, and they then go to the GP. So it's a taboo topic, and you very quickly get a big lobby saying that you're sort of denigrating the experiences of people with mental health difficulties. But we've got an issue with over-medicalisation of
people
mental
who are
health
really
issues.
suffering from very, very severe issues that, you know, make their lives basically not worth living. And that comes down to, sometimes it is a medical condition, but a lot of the time it is wider sociological factors. You know, one of the biggest causes of anxiety in the UK today is money issues.
Right.
We can't just remove the economic and sociological context.
I mean, David, is there an issue also with resources?
Well,
resources in mental health services, resources in terms of waiting lists?
There are pilots already of attaching work coaches to GP practices. Expand that dramatically, train them properly so they know what they're doing. I'm going to put myself in danger now.
Right,
I think Freddie has a point. There is an issue about when people feel down, they feel that they're clinically depressed, and we've got to try and be able to distinguish when people are seriously ill and they need immediate support and treatment from people who need advice and help and the positive way forward, which is into a job and earning your own living and meeting people again. I'm a bit taken aback by Miriam actually talking about restricting social media, because I thought you were a libertarian a minute ago.
For children.
A minute ago you were, well, I happen to believe that you're right on it, but that completely contradicts
I'm not a libertarian,
what
David,
you said earlier. Of course you are.
I'm not.
You're
I'm
a
absolutely
national
not.
conservative.
Well, you can agree to disagree on your definition in terms of that. But in terms of a culture, I mean, Grace mentioned prevention. Not enough has been spent or done on prevention, has it? Preventative health has not been evident or central
this is where
in terms of health provision.
I would come back to the problem of growing up online and the huge change in childhood that there has been since the introduction of the iPhone in 2010 and social media became ubiquitous amongst children. That is the big factor that has changed. And if you look across the Western world, so not just in this country, so not just to do with political and economic conditions here, there is a collapse in young people's mental health from that period across the whole of the Western world, whether you look at suicide rates, feelings of depression and purposelessness.
That also coincides with a massive economic
Grace? The only common factor is smartphones and social media. And actually, if you start to look at the mechanisms of why they would make people depressed, isolated and more individualistic, it makes sense. And that is why when you come to prevention, we need to look at that rather than just...
we're going to talk to
expanding dramatically child and adolescent mental health services, including placement in schools, is a way forward.
Right, and obviously a lot of schools are...
in the first place.
Well, a lot of schools are considering, if they haven't done so already, keeping phones away from schools or certainly out of the classroom from the moment they arrive until the moment they leave.
There's very little evidence that some of these mental health interventions work. That's not to say that some of them don't, but surely what we should be focusing on, how do we stop so many of our young people getting sick in the first place?
You can't just chalk up like all people's mental health problems, young people's mental health problems, just to using phones.
So would you ban phones?
Of course, no, I wouldn't ban phones again, because, you know, I think it's vital for freedoms. I think schools, there's a legitimate, you know, contention to be made there. But there's a wider issue here, which you say all these problems started in 2010.
I didn't.
What
I
else
said
happened
the
then?
trajectory
This was
changed.
the aftermath of a massive economic crisis, which has impacted my generation massively. People went into the jobs market, there were no jobs, but you were still told you're on your own, you have to compete in this market society. There's no public services for you, there's no housing for you. In the same way that this wasn't true for previous generations.
I mean, it is a different economic agenda, isn't it, from when my generation, I should say, I'm a lot older than you, entered into the workforce.
I mean, it almost connects to the very first thing we started talking about with defence. The fact is, you talk about across the Western world. The same thing is true across Europe and across North America, which is that there isn't the money, there isn't the confidence that there was just 20 years ago. And so when we start almost talking about a kind of spiritual crisis, I do think we're edging up against that, where a lot of the sense of confidence as a culture seems to be ebbing away across these countries, and that is obviously a much thornier problem.
Well, let me then show you this on childcare. The independent expansion of funded childcare could jeopardise quality of provision, warns the watchdog. It's the National Audit Office. They're casting doubt on the ability of the government to actually meet the childcare commitments that it's made and were outlined in the budget earlier this year. It would be the rollout of the expansion of free childcare in England to 30 hours by September. Can the government deliver this childcare policy, Miriam?
I have serious doubts about whether it is deliverable, and I think
is that because you don't like it either?
Well, I don't like it. I don't think it's what parents want, and I don't think it's what's best for children. But I also don't think it's deliverable. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of nurseries are already closing because the money that is being given them to them at the moment is not enough. And by the time the government scheme is fully rolled out, if it is, the government will actually be responsible for buying 80% of childcare places in England, and yet the price will be fixed. And you don't need to be an economist to work out that probably a lot of players will leave the market at that point if they can't afford to provide. But I think the problem is that for 3 and 4-year-olds, there's good evidence that childcare, that group childcare can help a child socially, cognitively. It's good preparation for school. And there's very high take-up rates of that traditional 15 hours offer we've seen. But the evidence for under 3s, particularly under 2s, is very, very different in terms of the potential benefits, or in fact otherwise, of group care. And actually, parents don't want it. The vast majority of mums of under 4s actually want to spend more time with their child.
Do you know that? How do you know that?
Because the polling frequently says that if you look at CSJ, Civitas,
is there not a contradiction here between getting people back into work and then saying mothers should have no choice other than to have to raise their children full time?
I think we should absolutely have choice.
Well, I mean, I assume it's mostly, it generally falls on mothers.
It normally is. But I think choice, you're absolutely right. We need a system of choice. What's the point of spending £4 billion that might get 60,000 people back into work and also will require 40,000 childcare jobs? Or why not put that money in people's pockets through cash, through vouchers, through tax cuts that would enable families to choose how they look after their children in those early years? That is the choice agenda.
David?
Well, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies in their recent report demonstrated, the government should never have done away with Sure Start. It was an intensive, holistic programme and it worked. And we've got a very silly situation here where the government have decided not to have the pilot that they promised previously. So they're not testing the programme. They're doing away with some of the key training programmes. They call it defunding, BTEC National Diploma, which is a route to childcare training, which is absolutely crucial to getting the 40,000 that they claim they're going to get. And we need a rethink. Where I agree with Grace and disagree with Miriam is I think the train has left the station a long time ago, Miriam, in terms of whether mums should stay at home. I think they want the choice and they want to be able to go to work.
We haven't mentioned grandparents here. But, if you're talking about putting choice back to people and trying more kind of organic solutions, we have another problem as a society, which is the other end of the age spectrum and care for older people. Those things work together. I wonder whether we should be more creative, thinking about, for example, stamp duty holidays for families reuniting, for allowing grandparents to come closer to their kids when they have children, and allowing some of this childcare to be done the way it has been done for centuries, which is granny and grandpa help.
Well, I mean, a lot of grandparents don't particularly want to do that. But I think this is all just, there's lots of different ways of trying to get around a problem, which is, do we invest as a society in care, or do we spend the money on other things like tax cuts, which is what we've been seeing from this government, and defence spending and massive handouts?
Well, but Grace,
on
that issue, what do you think about the idea of a change in the system, pivoting away from childcare and trying to encourage members of families to look after their kids or their grandkids?
I do actually agree that there should be a choice, but that has to be a real choice. I do very much agree with Lord Blunkett that the removal of Sure Start centres was a gross error, and it's something that we've seen in the statistics on early years development has had a really, really significant impact. So that is something that, tomorrow we could, start Sure Start again. That would be a really easy way to actually introduce some genuine choice.
I don't disagree with that, and I think intervening early to help parents learn how to be parents and gain confidence is a much better money spent than taking children off parents. But I think this is where we just have to look at the evidence. And for 3 and 4-year-olds, yes, there's good evidence that good care and socialising with other children is a good thing. But an under 2-year-old is a completely different entity altogether. And all the research about attachment and one-on-one care, we should be looking at the evidence, and there should be genuine choice.
I don't disagree.
Whereas at the moment, the only choice, if
fathers.
you want, I totally agree. If you want to be supported by the state, as a parent of an early years child at the moment, you have one choice. That is to put your 9-month-old in 30 hours of institutional care. That's not a choice. That's you can have support if you go this way. And I think we should repurpose the budget and make it about genuine choice so that people can afford to live on the income that they have when their children are young, and they don't have to make...
It's also more realistic because we don't have the money.
Well, the bottom
I'm
line...
half Swedish. We're not going to have a Swedish welfare system.
The bottom line...
Well, you could if you increase taxes.
If you invested in it.
So we need to be innovative about helping people find better solutions in their families.
Of course we do. The bottom line is socialisation. The bottom line is actually, yes, giving them choice. We learnt that from the pandemic. We're still picking up the pieces from the isolation of the pandemic.
Right, we have got Prime Minister's questions. It's actually with the deputies, Deputy Leader Oliver Dowden, and he will be asked questions by Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner. There's the scene inside the Commons you can see there. It'll be filling up with MPs shortly, and we will take you in 10 minutes' time. There's the Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris there at the dispatch box. Let's talk about carers' allowance. Grace is right, we heard it and saw somebody there in the headlines. Because the PM's dementia advisor, we can show you the story in BBC News, quits over benefits clawback policy. Now, for all of you who, of course, are watching and are glued to Politics Live every day, you will remember that last week we heard from a carer who was shocked and sickened to her stomach, as she said, when she was told she would have to pay back thousands of pounds because of overclaiming inadvertently benefits. Now, Johnny Timpson, who was the UK's inaugural disability ambassador, said clawing back benefit overpayments was devastating for families. What do you think the government should do, David Blunkett? Should they pause this? Should they write off these overpayments? I mean, it's a substantial amount of money.
Well, some people have run up tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Which meant that there wasn't sufficient monitoring and intervention in the first place. The system needs simplifying. There needs to be what's called a sensible taper, so that when you go over the recognised amount, you don't automatically lose the lot. If you go 50p, a pound a week,
which is what's
over,
happened in a lot of
they
cases.
lose the lot. And it's that's being clawed back. And I think a common sense approach would be, can we encourage carers? We've just had a debate about societal issues and whether government can do it all. Carers are the great unsung heroes of keeping the system going. That's civil society at its best.
What should the government do, Miriam?
Well, I'm not massively familiar with this, and I think what David has said is very sensible. And certainly, I've had similar cases in my constituency of people who've had all their child benefit clawed back immediately that they go over the earning threshold. And similarly, sometimes it feels very much like the system is not particularly compassionate, and I think that needs to be looked at. But David's right, you know, all this focus on people who are economically inactive, but so many of them are actually caring for the old and the young, doing an absolutely important job for society. And I think we need to recognise them as such.
Right. I mean, at the moment, there have been calls from Ian Duncan-Smith for at least a pause while this is investigated. But you're right, because the carers allowance is worth £81.90 per week. People can earn up to £151 per week and still get it. After that, if they earn £1 over this limit, as you were saying, David, or 50p, they lose 100% of that benefit.
And that doesn't seem sensible at all. But I think, going back to our previous conversation, if we as a society are willing to pay people to be carers of those in their old age, why are we not also willing to pay people to be carers of their own young children, their own relatives, in their early years?
All right, let's talk about Frank Field, because you mentioned him, former Labour MP and crossbencher. David Blunkett, he's died. He was a sort of maverick, an independent thinker, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was great. We need more. We need more Frank
yeah.
Fields. They're the grit in the oyster. I loved Frank. And I think he did a terrific job, both for his constituency and raising issues, often cutting-edge issues, which were controversial. And I could have my disagreements with Frank, like other people, but everybody across the political spectrum and beyond respected him and understood where he came from and his dedication, and we'll miss him greatly.
Miriam, I don't know if you knew him or had met him at all.
I had the pleasure of meeting him once, very soon after I was elected, and I got involved with some work Andrea Ledson was doing on the early years, actually, and he was there, and I remember just, well, being a bit starstruck, to be honest, because he is a bit of a political hero.
David, what are your sort of other recollections of him? Because mine are very much of him as a welfare campaigner.
He was a welfare campaigner. He believed in teaching people to fish rather than giving them the fish. He had some projects in his own constituency. One of them was about early years and how you could get in at that point and make a difference to lives. He also campaigned and persuaded Gordon Brown, who didn't need much persuading, that we should have the system that deals with unclaimed assets, where there's literally hundreds of millions of pounds locked in the financial institutions where nobody knows who put them there. There's no record of any relatives or anything, and that's being drawn down on, and he should be remembered for that, because it's funding some incredible schemes, including with young people.
I mean, am I right in remembering it was David Cameron that actually asked him to carry out a review of how money should be spent and how it would be best spent, in fact, in terms of putting it into early years, which is what he said, but it was shelved, I think.
He did, and he had the same problem as Tony Blair had in '97, because he made him a minister and he attended cabinet. But being frank, he really couldn't put up with the collective responsibility. And I shared his worry, because I had the same problem. And therefore, Frank, because he was a lovable maverick, was able to raise issues that it's very difficult to do when you're caught up in the collective responsibility.
I think his death just sort of reminds about the quality of today's Parliament. I'm sorry to have a bleak note there, but where are the Frank Fields in today's Parliament? Independent thinkers, unafraid to get praised by the opposition, picking up issues. It doesn't feel to an outsider like they're there in the same quantity.
The selection process has been so centralised in both parties that you don't get independent-minded thinkers, because they're all basically hand-picked from the leader's office, effectively. And it's also worth bearing in mind, by the way, that when we're talking about Frank Field, we should also look at the country that he's left behind, and the fact that we have astonishingly high levels of child poverty. There was a report out the other day that showed that absolute poverty has been increasing, and I think the statistic was that it's now a quarter of children live in poverty in this country, which is absolutely astonishing, and it's an utter failure of more than a decade of austerity.
Oh, well, Miriam.
Well, I just want to pick up on Freddie's point, which I think is a very good one, about independent thinking amongst politicians. And I think the problem is that the incentive structure for MPs is basically toe the party line or you'll never be promoted. Now, that might seem a little bit self...
But that was always the case, wasn't it?
Potentially, although I think there's a lot less tolerance to having policy disagreements in public than perhaps there used to be. And you look at what happens to somebody who doesn't toe the party line. Like what's happened to Rosie Duffield, for example, who actually has been proven right in recent weeks. But you know, the incentives to speak out and criticise or at least just challenge policy are not there. And of course MPs think, if I become a minister, I'll actually be able to change things, and maybe that's fair enough.
Is that why you haven't been promoted? Is that because
you're
very outspoken?
Maybe.
Well, I was brought into the Labour front bench less than a year after I came into Parliament for one good reason: to shut me up.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Rather have you inside the vault than outside. I think we can show you some pictures of Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, with Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor. There's been some disquiet, I think, in Berlin, that it's taken a long time for Rishi Sunak to pay a visit. But, of course, it's all discussions about defence and collaborating on security. There they are together there. Obviously watching a military parade, as is customary on these kinds of visits. But, obviously, the common threat here being Russian war in Ukraine and the announcements of that defence spending. We have Prime Minister's questions coming up in a few minutes' time. As I said, it's with Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, putting the questions, because, as we've seen, Rishi Sunak isn't here, which means Keir Starmer won't be there either. And it is in the middle still of a police investigation into Angela Rayner's living arrangements, historic living arrangements, and potential electoral issues. Do you think she's been treated fairly, David?
No, I think that the idea, and people of Greater Manchester must feel this in spades, that 12 police officers should be diverted onto this issue is very worrying. I think we're in danger, and it will increase in the next 6 months, of tit for tat. There's going to be a lot of accusations, calls for police to investigate. We've had a bellyful of it anyway over the last 3 or 4 years in politics. My underlying worry, apart from what it does to Angela, is what it does to politics. We are trashing our politics, and democracy is fragile.
Right, and on that basis then, do you think it was wrong of Labour to call for a police investigation, talking of tit for tat, into Mark Menzies,
Well,
now former Conservative?
he'd already quit. It was very clear what had happened. I'm not sure the police intervening will take us much further on that case.
Right. Do you agree with Angela Rayner being unfairly treated and far too much police resource being diverted to this?
I agree wholeheartedly with what David said. I think we should be careful what we careful what we wish for. Look at what's going on in the States. Of course, politicians shouldn't be above the law, but neither should we weaponise the police. And if we're not careful, the only people who will want to come into politics are those with enough money to pay good lawyers, or those who don't care what other people think about them, and that's the dangerous kind of situation.
Well, there's a wider problem here, isn't it? Which is that the public have just been bombarded with successive news stories of basically corrupt or very badly behaving MPs over the last, particularly the last kind of 10 or 12 years. We had that whole Boris Johnson sleaze fest issue where, there were all sorts of issues around potential dodgy payments or whatever. There was David Cameron lobbying on behalf of Greensill in the midst of a pandemic. I think I agree Angela Rayner has been treated unfairly, but I think the reason that these issues become so charged is that people don't trust in our democracy. There is not sufficient accountability. And that is something that requires.
But let's just hope, we're about to watch PMQs, let's hope that the two deputies don't go at each other over these sleaze issues. There's going to be a huge temptation there. Spads will be encouraging them to land some blows. We've got much bigger fish to fry, dare I say it. We had this defence discussion. Maybe she could lead on that. I think we'll find out in 5 minutes if the front bench is going to have some more ambition than just going at this race to the bottom.
Right,
well, we've agreed. This is amazing.
Ended on agreement.
Astonishing.
It was all part of my design that by the time we reach Prime Minister's questions, even if it is questions to the deputies, that everybody would agree. But it does then beg the question about, as you said, Miriam, who wants to be in politics and the sorts of people that will be attracted to politics. Does that worry you?
Very much so, and I think politics is a risky business. You're risking your reputation. Everything you do is public. I may or may not lose my job at some point this year. Everything I've ever said will be on record for the rest of my life. That is a big risk to take. And so you need people who are willing to take that risk. But at the same time, if you're constantly under the threat of being reported to the police by your opposition for eating a piece of cake, it doesn't encourage the people with the right kind of motives and groundedness to come into politics. And that is a huge worry.
David?
Well, the worry is that this is going to be a very dirty general election. It will do nothing for anyone.
Agreed.
Right. When do you think it's going to be?
November.
You think it'll be November?
Yeah, I did think it was going to be October, but the runes are that they might go through their conference. I mean, to cancel the conferences would be damaging to Labour rather than to Tories, because we'd raise a lot of money from our conference.
What about exact 5-year anniversary, December the 12th?
No, too late.
Christmas party.
Too late.
He could wait for potentially a second interest rate cut, because we'll probably get one in August.
Well,
maybe he'll want to.
That's certainly the sort of orthodoxy is that if inflation comes down further, there's an interest rate cut. When would you like the election to be?
Well, I was just going to say, I'm glad it's not me who has to make the decision. I mean, we had a discussion earlier, should he just name the date, but then would that actually disempower the government? And
you wanted it earlier, didn't you?
Well,
you wanted
I think there are advantages to going earlier. I think things could get worse as well as better.
What are the advantages to going earlier?
Yeah, what are the
advantages to going earlier to you?
Well, everybody thinks something is going to turn up and the world will get better. Equally, the opposite could happen. We can't see the future, can we? But I think October, November seems to be the sensible, educated person's guess, so I'm going to go with that.
It's hard to think how it could get any worse for the Conservatives at this point, isn't it?
Anyway, I'd like it, Miriam, to be as early as possible, and I'd help you afterwards.
In that case,
have you got some
your P45?
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
the other speculation is exactly the same day as the American presidential election, first Thursday in November. that will be a big week if that happens.
I mean, I think what's been demonstrated is that none of us know.
None of us.
And none of us
Another
can tell
point of random
whether or not
speculation.
what is actually
Very
going to
good.
happen.
Very
I think it is
edifying.
time, although it is running a few minutes late, for Prime Minister's questions, but with Oliver Dowden and Angela Rayner.
Jonathan Gullis.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have been asked to reply. I know that members across the House will wish to join me in offering condolences to the family and friends of Lord Frank Field. He was an outstanding parliamentarian who worked tirelessly to make society a better place. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is in Berlin. He has announced the biggest strengthening of our defence in a generation. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that members will also want to join me in wishing the Jewish community a happy Passover, a celebration of freedom. But of course, we remember the empty chairs of those hostages still being held captive in Gaza and call for their immediate release. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Jonathan Gullis.
Mr. Speaker, I too would like to pass on my thoughts and prayers to Lord Field's family, friends and colleagues, and particularly the students and teachers at the Birches Head Academy in Stoke-on-Trent who are part of the Frank Field Education Trust. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, since being elected in 2019, I've helped reopen Tunstall Town Hall with a new library and family hub, secured funding for additional CCTV, a new alley gate and better lighting in Tunstall to make sure our streets are safe. Breathing new life as well into Tunstall's old library in Bath thanks to this government's levelling up fund of 56 million to Stoke-on-Trent. But sadly, Labour-led Stoke-on-Trent City Council seek to undermine this progress by introducing a brand new garden tax on residents to have their garden waste collected, refuse to take cunning enforcement against rogue and absent landlords who plague Tunstall High Street, and are increasing crime and antisocial behaviour by dumping undesirable people in the centre of Tunstall at Sneed Arms Hotel. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that Stoke-on-Trent Labour...
Order. It's not only Mr. Gullis who's loud, so please, let me hear it.
It just goes to show the disdain the Labour Party have for Stoke-on-Trent. So does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me? It's time for Stoke-on-Trent Labour to axe the garden tax, to take the fight to lousy landlords and...
Order. There is a question to be asked, and there is a time in which we ask it. I suggest he puts in for an adjournment debate. I'm sure you've got the answer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's not much I can add to that. He has ever proved what an excellent campaigner he is for his constituents. And of course, he highlights the same problems with Labour councils across the country, raising taxes and letting services fall into disrepair. And of course, he's totally right to be holding rogue landlords to account.
Right, we now come to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I first of all share with the Deputy Prime Minister's comments regarding our Jewish community and a happy Passover, and also start by acknowledging the loss of David Marquand and Baroness Massey, both of whom made historic contributions in this Parliament, politics and wider life. And also send my condolences following today's news to the family of Lord Frank Field, who is a good friend of mine and a colleague, and who was a tireless campaigner against poverty and a champion for his constituents. Mr. Speaker, I know the party opposite is desperate to talk about my living arrangements, but the public want to know what this government is going to do about theirs. Natalie from Brighton has been served with 2 no-fault eviction notices in 18 months. She joins nearly 1 million families at risk of homelessness due to his party's failure to ban this cruel practice. Now, instead of obsessing over my house, when will he get a grip and show the same obsession with ending no-fault evictions?
Well, to begin with, it is a pleasure to have another exchange with the Right Honourable Lady in this House, our 5th in 12 months. Any more of these, and she'll be claiming it as her principal residence. On the issue of no-fault evictions, it may have escaped the Right Honourable Lady's attention, but we will be voting on exactly that matter later today. The Conservative government taking action.
Mr. Speaker, he clearly thought he could spend all week obsessing over my living arrangements. I didn't even bother to read up on his own government's bill this afternoon. The reality is, he caved in to vested interests on his backbenchers and delayed justice for people like Natalie. Yes. This week, the Housing Minister said there is no solid date for banning no-fault evictions. The Housing Secretary now says it won't happen before an election. So if he can give us a date, can he name it now?
I can name the date for the Right Honourable Lady. Today. It's today that this House will be voting on it, and I'm confident that in line with our manifesto, we will deliver on that commitment.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, he clearly hasn't been looking up on his own government bills. But let me turn to another Tory housing failure. Leaseholds are a rip-off and a con. But the government's proposed ban on new leaseholds applies only to houses. The majority of leaseholds are in flats. What's the point on a ban on new leaseholds if it won't apply to flats?
Again, the Right Honourable Lady is talking about legislation introduced by this government, which the party opposite totally failed to introduce in their entire time in office. And it's no surprise, because it's this government which has brought social housing waiting lists down by nearly 500,000 and delivered more affordable homes in the last year and the last 12 years than Labour delivered when they were in office. But of course, all of this can only be paid for by making sure that we have a strong economy. And I'll tell you, her policy to repeal every single Conservative trade union law in the first 100 days would open the door to French-style wildcat strikes, sweeping away the reforms that made this country great. And we all know, though, Mr. Speaker, the one reform that the Right Honourable Lady would not abolish from Margaret Thatcher, the right to buy your council house.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, I was expecting a little bit better from him today. He seems to be a bit worn out. Maybe it's the 3 a.m. calls from the bad men that have been keeping him up at night. But he also, Mr. Speaker, he also talks about strikes and the unions. We've had more strikes under this government's watch than any time before. And once again, he hasn't read his own bill. Their ban on leasehold won't apply to the majority of people. It's like banning non-doms but exempting Tory prime ministers. And he speaks about affordable homes. Families are trapped in temporary accommodation and stuck on waiting lists. And in the West Midlands, his mayor has used his multi-million-pound housing budget to build just 46 social homes in 8 years. That's almost as many as the Chancellor's property portfolio. But the British people know that his party won't build the homes that this country needs. So when are they going to get a chance to vote for a government that will?
Well, I'm surprised the Right Honourable Lady raises the West Midlands when Labour-controlled Birmingham have virtually bankrupted the council, are hiking up council tax by 21%, whilst in the meantime, and I'm sure this would please her, continuing to hand out 1.8 million to the trade unions. By contrast, Andy Street, our brilliant mayor of the wider West Midlands, has delivered £6.1 billion of investment to improve transport. So there you have it, the contrast between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. The usual political opportunism from her, failing to ask about the issues that really matter. If you want more bins, if you want more bin collections, more potholes filled, lower debt and lower council tax, vote Conservative, because whether it's Ben Houchen in the Tees Valley or whether it's Andy Street in the West Midlands, it's only the Conservative mayors who deliver more for less.
Well, Mr Speaker, that's pretty revealing that he thinks that housing isn't an issue for the British people, because I think it really is. And people in glass houses shouldn't throw the stones, because in Birmingham and across the whole of this country, councils are facing black holes because of his government's austerity programme. And I would also warn the Deputy Prime Minister that Tory councils have also faced 114 notices, and Birmingham Council has had over £1 billion taken from their budget from some of the poorest people. More than 16,000 families face losing their homes after the party's mini-budget, Mr Speaker, and mortgage bills continue to soar. Meanwhile, the former Prime Minister parades around the world in a twisted victory lap promoting a new book, saying that the mini-budget was her proudest moment. So since she won't apologise to those families losing their home, will he?
Well, what the Prime Minister has done since he has taken office with the Chancellor is to restore stability to our economy, inflation halved and more down to 3%. And as a result of that, in an increasingly dangerous world, the Prime Minister was able to announce his plan for the biggest strengthening of defence spending in a generation. But it should come as no surprise that the party opposite refuse to say whether they back it or not, because this comes from the Right Honourable Lady who voted to scrap Trident and install in Downing Street someone who wanted to change the army into a Peace Corps. There you have it.
Mr Speaker, defence, we all want to see 2.5%. The difference is that we haven't cut the army to its smallest size since Napoleon. And Mr Speaker, never mind some secretive deep state. Never mind some secretive deep state. It's the state of the Tory party that's the problem. They're in a deep state of sewerage. After 14 years, they failed renters, they failed leaseholders, and they failed mortgage holders. But, Mr Speaker, I read with interest that the Right Honourable Gentleman has been urging his neighbour in Number 10 to call an election because he's worried they might get wiped out. Has he finally realised that when he stabbed Boris Johnson in the back to get his mate into Number 10, he was ditching their biggest election winner for a pint-sized loser?
I think the whole House will have heard, despite all the bluster from the lady opposite, not a single word on whether she would actually back our plans to invest in our armed forces. No plans in a dangerous world. And of course, as ever, the Deputy Leader is always looking to attack others' failures, but never the one to take responsibility for her own. She once said, "You shouldn't be waiting for the police to bang on your door. If you did it, then you shouldn't be doing your job." The Right Honourable Landlady should forget her tax advice and follow her own advice.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And levelling up like my friend earlier, in the Calder Valley is absolutely on fire. £196.5 million for hospital reconfiguration, £150 million for flood defences, no fewer than 11 schools being remodelled or rebuilt as we speak. 45 million for 3 town centre regeneration, and Elland is getting a new railway station as well. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that the naysayers around about levelling up need look no further than the Calder Valley to see what a great achievement this government is doing?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. It's not just the Colne Valley, but it's communities up and down the country. The government is investing billions in infrastructure across the United Kingdom, creating jobs and opportunities in every region. And I know that my honourable friend has been a staunch advocate for the Calder Valley, which is a fantastic example of that in action.
It's leader of the SNP, Murray Black.
May I join in wishing the Jewish community a happy Passover and also in sending my condolences to the families of family and loved ones of Frank Field. 2 years ago, when mass graves were discovered in Ukraine, this House united in condemnation and rightly treated these graves as evidence of war crimes which Russia must be made to answer for. Yesterday, Palestinian officials uncovered 2 mass graves outside the bombed hospitals in Gaza. These graves also constitute as a war crime, don't they?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, of course, we would expect the democratic government of Israel to investigate any allegations of misconduct, and that's exactly what they do, and it's exactly what the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister urge them to do. But I find it quite extraordinary that she seeks to draw parallels between the legitimate war of self-defence of Israel and the conduct of Russia.
Murray Black.
300 bodies, including the elderly and the injured, some of which had been stripped naked, mutilated, with their hands tied behind their backs. The UK's own arms policy states that if there is even a risk that war crimes may be taking place, then that is reason enough to halt the sale of arms. Given all we know, why then is the Prime Minister yet to do so?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, we continue to urge the Israeli government to investigate any allegations of misconduct. The difference, though, is that we can trust the Israeli government, a democratically elected government, to properly investigate those things. And, of course, we keep the advice under review. The Foreign Secretary has recently made it clear that he has conducted a determination and has not changed his advice regarding export licences, and I think that is the correct decision.
Colin McCartney.
Speaker, the good people of Lincoln who all declare their taxes and pay tax on their profit when selling their second homes overwhelmingly want Lincoln Christmas Market to be brought back after the Labour-run City Council cruelly closed it last year. The Labour City Councils refused to do what the people of Lincoln want. What message will the Deputy Prime Minister send to the voters of Lincoln before next week's local elections?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I'm afraid that what the honourable gentleman has described is the Grinch in action. That Christmas market in the home of the Magna Carta was beloved by local residents. They have totally ignored the wishes of local residents and cancelled it, and they should reverse that decision.
Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Liberal Democrats, may I also offer our condolences to the friends and family of the late Lord Frank Field, and to wish a happy Passover to all those in the Jewish community. Mr. Speaker, unpaid carers have shared heartbreaking stories of how they have been hounded by the DWP and told to pay huge fines for minor infringements on carers' allowance earning rules, all because the government failed to do anything about a problem they have known about for years. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, one of the Prime Minister's own dementia advisers resigned, saying that this government's treatment of those unpaid carers was beyond the pale. So will the Deputy Prime Minister apologise to all those unpaid carers who have been failed by his government and commit to a full review of the system?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, I pay tribute to all those unpaid carers. Indeed, I met some of them over the weekend. I know how hard they work and they keep our society functioning through their commitment to us. And that's why we've actually uprated the benefits by £81.90 a week and increased the carers allowance by almost £1,500 since 2010. Now, in respect of allegations of overpayment, of course, appropriate discretion should be shown, but if it is the case that there have been erroneous overpayments, it's right on behalf of the taxpayer to be able to recuperate those. But of course, we'll work with anyone who's struggling with those repayments to negotiate sustainable and affordable repayment plans.
Virginia Crosby.
Mr Speaker, my Ireland constituency of Unismore is accessed via two bridges, the Menai Suspension Bridge and the Britannia Bridge. Holyhead is the second busiest port in the UK, but bridge repairs and the weather can result in long traffic queues. To make the most of our Anglesey Freeport and new nuclear at Wilver, a third crossing is vital. And last year, the Welsh Labour government scrapped plans for all new road projects, including our third bridge. On behalf of my Unismore constituents, will the Deputy Prime Minister use his influence to ensure that North Wales is not ignored by Cardiff and we get that third bridge?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I know and understand the frustration across Wales, and particularly in the Honourable Lady's constituency, with this state of affairs. The Welsh Government have not prioritised building new roads. They're damaging growth potential in places like Anglesey. They're spending over £100 million on new politicians. And we will work with the Right Honourable Lady to make sure we resolve this.
Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Conservative candidate for London Mayor has promoted Islamophobic tropes online,
Shame on her.
endorsed the beliefs of Enoch Powell, and claimed the black community has a problem with crimes. In the week that we marked the 31st anniversary of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, does the Deputy Prime Minister really endorse these views?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I think the Honourable Lady knows that she does not correctly represent the views of the candidate. And I find it extraordinary that she raises the issue of crime, because whilst Labour's London Mayor has increased the precept by over 70%. Actually, recorded crime has increased 20% in London. That is the record of the Labour London Mayor, and no wonder people will be voting against him.
Cheryl Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I note that I'm the chair of the Fisheries APPG and thank the Government for the recent pollock catch compensation. On the 12th of May, we will see the first ever National Fishing Remembrance Day. I'll be marking this occasion by laying a wreath at a service being held at Looe Quayside by the memorial plaque, which has the name of my late husband and unfortunately others on it. Will the Deputy Prime Minister, and will he ask the Prime Minister to mark this occasion by remembering those who have died, bringing this important food source to our table?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I know how important this is to the Honourable Lady, and I'm sure she will be remembering her late husband, Neil, on this day. It's important that we all recognise the sacrifices made by fishermen and women to bring food to our table, and I know that my colleague, Minister Spencer, will be visiting Grimsby on that day.
At Weston.
Mr Speaker, in today's Northern Echo, Borough Chairman Steve Gibson describes the Mayor of Tees Valley as having given away the future of the region's children. He was referring to the 40% of Tees Works with a forecast worth of £500 million gifted by Lord Houchin in a deal to two local business mates. Mr Gibson, who helped establish the Local Development Corporation, describes it as unforgivable. Will the government finally admit Lord Houchin and the Conservatives have sold the Teesside taxpayers down the river?
He talks about Teesside taxpayers. Actually, Ben Houchin has never imposed a mayoral precept in Tees Valley, full stop. And actually, at the same time, he's saved Teesside Airport and secured a new free port for Teesside. No wonder people will be voting for him again.
So Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr Speaker, can I ask my right honourable friend if he has seen the video that is doing the rounds of the theft in the shop in my constituency, Station Road, Boots the Chemist. In a space of 8 minutes, 2 threatening individuals robbed thousands of pounds out of that shop. And they're not alone. This is happening again and again and again. In fact, one of my team went out and photographed them leaving, brazenly, not caring, and even spitting at the police. Will you now please say to the Home Secretary, through to the police, this is not a petty crime. This is a threat of violence and massive robbery. This should be a priority for the police. What we just talk about always is more police. Surely what we should be asking to be is more effective policing and get them off the streets.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I think my right honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight this, and often it's the allegedly lower level crimes are the ones that cause the biggest impact on communities. And I know that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has been very clear on that point, and I will make it to him again. Is also why we're rolling out a range of crime prevention measures through the Safer Streets Fund, improving CCTV and street lighting, and we introduced the Police Crime and Sentencing Courts Act, again to give greater powers to the police to deliver tougher sentences for more serious offenders.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier on in the session, the Deputy Prime Minister said that when the Prime Minister and Chancellor took office, they restored stability to the UK economy. Who does he think caused the instability?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I remember. They might want to forget it, but I remember the day the day the Conservatives came into office in 2010, and what was the note left on the desk of the Chief Secretary? There is no money left. That is the challenge that we have addressed through the Prime Minister and Chancellor successively.
Mr. Speaker, Labour's mayoral candidate in the West Midlands talks about housing but makes no commitment to protect our precious Greenbelt. He talks about transport, but he fails to commit to reopening Aldridge train station. And he committed to saving police stations such as Aldridge. Then when the Labour PCC said he would close them, he changed his mind and agreed to that. So we are left wondering, in my constituency, what does he stand for? So does my right honourable friend agree with me that only Mayor Andy Street has a plan and a track record to be trusted to deliver for the West Midlands?
Well, as ever, my right honourable friend is absolutely correct to highlight the record of Labour's Police and Crime Commissioner. And West Midlands Police have actually been put in special measures on Simon Foster's watch. And when it comes to the Greenbelt, we've all seen the new wheeze from the Labour Party. Redesignate Greenbelt, Greybelt and concrete all over it. Well, the Conservatives will not allow that to happen, and people up and down the country will vote Conservative to stop that happening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Conservative ministers like to blame strikes and the pandemic for the appalling waiting times in the NHS. The Blackpool Teaching Hospitals Trust hasn't hit its target for seeing patients in A&E within 4 hours since 2015. Before the strikes, before the pandemic, but 5 years after the Conservatives came to office. So who does the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, blame for that?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, the party opposite like to pretend the pandemic didn't happen, and they like... That is the cause of the biggest pressure on the NHS. And they complain about NHS performance whilst backing strikes by doctors who unreasonably want a 35% pay rise. And despite all of those pressures, actually, A&E performance has improved in the past month.
Mr. Speaker, the Labour leader of the almost bankrupt Hastings Borough Council and several other Labour councillors resigned from the Labour Party, citing that the National Labour Party has become overly authoritarian, a dereliction of local democracy, has lost its moral compass and is suffocating local voices because its only objective is power for power's sake. Would the Deputy Prime Minister agree that voting for Conservative candidates in upcoming elections will ensure local voices are heard and local democracy is upheld and better services are delivered?
Deputy Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the really serious concerns about Labour councillors in Hastings. And this is what one former Labour councillor said. Labour are no longer providing the policies, support or focus on local government. I couldn't have put it better myself.
Mary Glendon.
We're going to leave Deputy Prime Minister's questions there. If anything important develops, we will, of course, bring it to you. Let's introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, Energy Minister Andrew Bowie. For Labour, the Labour Party Chair, Annalise Dodds. And the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent, Henry Zeffman. Welcome to all of you. Well, Henry, there was a certain amount of knockabout feel between Angela Rayner and Oliver Dowden. They have, of course, I think, met now 5 times across the dispatch box, standing in for their bosses. But very quickly, slightly self-deprecating in terms of the stories around the living arrangements of Angela Rayner. She herself offered that up. But then talked about the Renters Reform Bill, which we are expecting, of course, in Parliament shortly. And this idea of no-fault evictions, is it going to be in this bill?
Well, there are always pretty spiky exchanges between Angela Rayner and Oliver Dowden, and I don't think it would have come as a surprise to anyone that they were especially spiky today, given the situation that Angela Rayner is in. In terms of the substance of their exchange, is actually pretty meaty, and I think worth reflecting, as we have done before, that housing is suddenly rocketing up the political agenda in a way that at this stage of the last Parliament, and perhaps for a decade, if not more before, it really wasn't. Both parties suddenly sort of quite gripped with the question of the living situation, especially of young people, though the definition of young for these purposes is not necessarily what everyone would say. So renters reform is one of a couple of really important pieces of legislation that was touched upon there. The House of Commons is going to debate this bill later. Michael Gove would say, yes, it absolutely fulfils his commitment to abolish no-fault evictions. What Angela Rayner was suggesting is a couple of things. Firstly, that there's a fear that even still it could be watered down by Conservative MPs. A lot of Conservative MPs are quite anxious about it. They would say on principle grounds. They say the government shouldn't be interfering in what are contracts between landlord and tenant. But also, there is already this slightly strange caveat that it won't be introduced, this ban on no-fault evictions, until there's been an assessment of how that would work through the courts. And that's where a lot of the political meat of this debate is.
Well, before I come to our politicians on the panel, let's just remind our viewers of what the Housing Community Secretary Michael Gove told my colleague Laura Kunsberg in February.
We have a bill, it's gone through its stages in the House of Commons, and that bill does a number of things to help people in the private rented sector, including ending no-fault evictions. Why does that matter, some might ask? Well, it is the case that there are a small minority of unscrupulous landlords who use the threat of eviction either to jack up rents or to silence people who are complaining about the quality of their homes. It's important that we deal with that abuse because the vast majority of landlords do a great job and you need a healthy private rented sector.
Will no-fault evictions be banned?
Yes, that is the purpose, or one of the purposes of the bill that we're debating and voting on later today. It's a manifesto commitment, and this government is absolutely committed to delivering on that for the reasons that Michael set out very clearly to Laura Kunsberg earlier this year.
Well, absolutely, except Angela Rayner questioned Oliver Dowden on the veracity of that, because the government has amended this bill so that any ban on no-fault evictions would only come into force, as Henry was saying, once an assessment of the county court possession system can be made, effectively putting the ban on hold for the foreseeable future. So, in other words, it won't happen in the way that Michael Gove and you and Oliver Dowden have set out.
No, that's not the case at all.
We're bringing
forward this legislation to deal with unscrupulous landlords, to end no-fault evictions. It's a manifesto commitment of this government, and we are going to deliver it. And the timing of its implementation is all down to whether or not Labour peers in the House of Lords actually let it get on the statute book and we actually begin taking action against those landlords that are skewing what is overall a very healthy private rented sector in the United Kingdom. But this is to deal with those people who are not acting properly, and we're committed to delivering on it.
Yeah, I'm afraid the government's backed down on doing what it promised, just as it's backed down also on banning new leasehold with that huge loophole around flats for leasehold, which are now going to still be allowed in the future. The reality is we're not going to be seeing these arrangements being banned in the foreseeable future. And what does that mean in practice? There's a family that I know where they were served one of these no-fault eviction notices. They had been model tenants. Their kids were at a local school. The place where they were staying was next to the work of both of the parents. They were served one of these notices. They've had to go into temporary accommodation. It's a very, very long way away from the kids' school. It's a very long way away from where the parents work. This is having a terrible impact on people and putting effectively new impediments in the way to banning Section 21 evictions. It's what the government's done because of internal pressure, Andrew, I'm afraid, and it's not good enough.
No, what we are doing is making sure that this bill is watertight and making sure that the action taken is appropriate and legal. And that is why we have inserted the stipulations that we have. But we are absolutely committed to ending no-fault evictions for the reasons that Michael Gove set out very clearly just there. We will deliver on this, and hopefully the Labour Party will vote with us this afternoon and make sure it moves on to the House of Lords and we can get it on the statute book.
Why have you put additional impediments in the way, and why also have you backed down? As I said before,
we've strengthened the bill
on leaseholders. So strengthening it is actually holding up the period before those measures are put in place. That's not many people's assessment of strengthening, I'm afraid.
But we need to make sure we get this right. And we need to make sure that those people who are acting properly are not punished unduly. And we need to make sure that the entire thing is watertight.
Andrew,
that is what we are doing.
He didn't mention that back in February. He just said there will be an end to no-fault evictions. When will Section 21 notices be stopped?
We want to get this on the statute book as soon as possible so we can move on to the next stage of the assessment.
In terms of issuing Section 21 notices?
We have a manifesto commitment and we're absolutely committed to delivering on that before the general election, and that's what we're seeking to do. And hopefully the Labour Party will help us in that effort by voting to ban no-fault evictions this afternoon.
But we don't need an assessment to know that this is wrong, to know that if people have been model tenants, like the family I just talked about, that they can be evicted through no fault of their own and end up homeless. That this isn't a question of gathering more data or evidence. It is wrong. The government promised to deal with it
and we are.
A long time ago. Well, actually, you've shoved more impediments in the way to getting to a ban. It's just not good enough.
It's vitally important. And we've seen what has happened recently when poor law has been made by legislators in particular in Scotland and the effect that that has on the private rented sector. We need to ensure that the action we are taking is proper, legally watertight, and will actually come to the point that we can end no-fault evictions, which is what we are committed to doing.
Just before we move on, what time frame would Labour, a Labour government, if you win the election, put on banning and scrapping no-fault evictions?
Well, we would be banning them very speedily. We would not be ultimately having additional consultations, additional legal measures that the government is jumping through. It seems because of pressure from some of those landlords, not good ones. Is it vested interest?
Absolutely not. And look, we could end no-fault evictions within the next few months if Labour voted with us this afternoon and voted for the bill in the House of Lords. It is the Labour Party that is voting against this bill. It is quite ridiculous, Annalise.
This is silly.
We find ourselves in a place where the Labour Party is voting not to stop no-fault evictions this afternoon, and I'm sure we'll be doing so in the House of Lords.
Can you explain something to me? I thought the Conservatives had a majority in the House of Commons. So you don't need to have Labour votes in order to pass a bit of legislation. We're desperate to get these measures
as you know, Annalise, we do not have
because we know about the impact.
As you know, we do not have a majority in the House of Lords, and that is where your peers will be ordered to vote against this bill.
We will bring you, of course, the results at some point on Politics Live from this bill. We reported yesterday, and we talked about it again today already, but I think I want to talk to our guests about it again. This is the death of 5 migrants in the Channel just off the French coast, including a 7-year-old girl. The scene was witnessed by a BBC crew. Let's take a look.
We are running with the police as they try to intercept a group of, it looks like 60 or 70 migrants.
And now things turn violent. Fireworks thrown at the police. Several young men pulling out crude weapons.
They're trying to protect the migrants as they head towards the sea to stop the police from stopping them.
And it works. A few stragglers are left behind, but the boat is allowed to move out towards open water. Look at the child on someone's shoulders on the right. Could the French police have done more to stop this?
Andrew, could they have done more?
Look, we have a very good and strong relationship with the French government, and we're working closely to stop scenes like that occurring. This is the reason that we passed the Rwanda bill at the beginning of the week, we need to stop this vicious and pernicious trade in human life that is costing human lives in the Channel right now. Everybody acknowledges that. We believe that imposing our Rwanda scheme, making it clear that you will not stay in the United Kingdom if you come here illegally, will help in that effort. But also we need to see more action being taken on the beaches. And I'm very glad that the strong relationship we have with the French government will allow the French police to act accordingly.
But part of what the government has done in terms of deterrence or trying to stop, as you say, the people smugglers is paying the French a lot of money.
Yes.
Nearly £500 million. Would you say that that's been money well spent when you watch that footage of what the police did or didn't do?
Look, obviously, individual cases, and that's just one example of many. The French police have been acting to assist both the French and the UK governments in achieving our aim of stopping the boats crossing the Channel. And the government keeps under review all of the activities on that side of the Channel and how best we can support the French government in their efforts. But if this is alongside all the other efforts that we are taking to ensure that this trade is ceased and we no longer see men, women and children put at risk by these people who are making money out of the trade in human life. And that is why what we did this week was so important.
Annalise, what was your reaction to that footage? Because if you win the election, you'll scrap the Rwanda scheme, as you have promised. So you'll be relying even more on French authorities and police to stop those boats taking or setting sail.
So this is an incredibly serious situation, and I think particularly given what we know about the people who died, this is really a moment when we need to have serious solutions. It's not a time for gimmicks. It's a time for a genuine focus on making sure we've got those policies in place to smash those criminal gangs, to get the backlog of asylum claimants actually processed, 100,000 people.
But what about watching there? People might be thinking, we're paying French authorities to stop these boats going into the water in the first place,
but we
overloaded with people.
What we don't have is the depth of international cooperation within policing, within intelligence that we need to get these criminal smugglers brought to justice. Because that scene that we just saw, that didn't happen by accident. There were many people involved in what took place before those people were on the beach, before they made that appallingly dangerous journey. And we should, instead of spending what are eye-watering amounts of money on the Rwanda scheme that's going to cover about 1% of the people covered by the backlog, £500 million going to Rwanda, we should be using that money to do a whole range of things, including
more to the French authorities.
Well, we need to have more joint police working. We would make sure that was covering the early intelligence, which is so important to prevent that. We also need more caseworkers because we've got a huge backlog under Rishi Sunak at the moment. Those cases are not being processed. We've got hotel use that's gone through the roof, unfortunately.
All of that is very laudable, and you've
Andrew,
not explained how these discussions or agreements would be actually arrived at.
Well, we have, and actually your government has seen returns going through the floor. That's why we'd set up a new returns unit with 1,000 more caseworkers to be processing these people.
Thousands of Albanians, just one example.
Yes,
thousands of Albanians returned to Albania due to an agreement struck by this Prime Minister and the Albanian government. And you are yet to explain what Labour would do. If you're not doing Rwanda, you're magically going to get a new deal with the French government, which, by the way, we've already negotiated. And as Joe has said, we're giving £500 million to support the policing effort there. But by removing the deterrence factor, which Rwanda will impose, you are going to be saying, come to the UK and you can stay here. Nothing will happen.
Let me just bring in
human life. Well, can I come back on that
all right,
later?
come back on.
Because I don't think I've got that right.
On it now.
Well, because I know that you're a clever man, right? And you're intimating that the Rwanda scheme is somehow going to deal with these issues. It's going to cover, by the government's own estimation, about 300 people. What we need is a system where people who shouldn't be staying here are returned. You don't have that because you're not processing those claims. Labour would, and we set out those plans. I don't understand why the government isn't moving forward on this.
Let me just bring in Henry, because, of course, this happened, this tragedy, in the wake of the Rwanda bill, the piece of legislation to deport some asylum seekers who arrive on our shores here to Rwanda. What is going going to happen? What's the expectation in terms of flights taking off and when the deterrent, as Rishi Sunak repeatedly says, kicks in?
Well, Rishi Sunak said the first flight would take off 8 to 10 weeks from now. And so that means we're 8 to 10 weeks away from two important questions, at least beginning to be answered. You know, they're both about, does this work? First is, does that legislation, which was designed to put this policy on a strong enough legal footing that a flight now finally does take off, you know, whether that works or whether actually some of the legal challenges which are going to begin imminently succeed in grounding a flight. But then secondly, should a flight, or what Rishi Sunak said he hoped would be a regular rhythm of flights takes off, we'll find out who's right in this debate. We'll find out whether this policy is a deterrent and stops footage like that, or whether it's not. And that's going to be a big moment for the government, even if it's a sort of unfolding moment rather than one particular moment, because either the crossings do come down as a result or they don't.
And of course, the pledge from Rishi Sunak, one of his many pledges, was to stop the boats. He's giving a press conference as we're talking here on the programme with Olaf Scholz, whom you can see there, the German Chancellor. And you mentioned housing moving up the agenda. Well, defence and spending more on defence and talking about collective security now seems to be a massive issue.
Huge. And it's fascinating watching Rishi Sunak in Poland yesterday, meeting both Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, and also Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary-General of NATO, then meeting Olaf Scholz, his German counterpart today, talking mostly about defence again. You know, no Prime Minister chooses to become a war Prime Minister. And Rishi Sunak, I think, his background, the fact that he was Chancellor before means that most people would have thought he would principally be an economy Prime Minister. But circumstances are circumstances, and it is unavoidably the case that he, as Prime Minister, and this would be true of Keir Starmer if he became Prime Minister as well, is preoccupied by a war on the European continent this week, at other times by a war in the Middle East. And the bleak global picture is affecting domestic politics, because the announcement in Poland that we've been talking about for the last day or so of more defence spending, that's going to have a lot of domestic ramifications too.
Well, let's ask Ben Zaranko of the Institute for Fiscal Studies about the detail of the announcements that have been made by Rishi Sunak, the government. Welcome to Politics Live, Ben, because the government says it will raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. Now, there have been, Boris Johnson committed the UK to doing so, but now by 2030, and says this amounts to an extra £75 billion over the next 6 years. Is that right?
I think it's a slightly inflated number and not a very helpful way of describing what is a genuinely big and significant announcement. The government is effectively assuming that not a single penny extra would have gone into defence otherwise over the next 6 years. It's then adding up all the extra money that will now go in, and it's summing it all up to get 75 billion. I think a more realistic number might be something like an extra 20 or 25 billion over the next 6 years, which is a significant sum, just not quite as big as the one plastered across the papers this morning.
Right, well, as you said, it's still a significant sum, although a lot less than £75 billion. I mean, the government doesn't appear to have adjusted its spending plans to take it into account. So no extra taxes have been announced or borrowing to fund this commitment. So where would the money come from?
In effect, the government's trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, it's saying this is a genuinely large, it's a game-changing amount of investment going into defence. But it's also saying this is small enough that we can make up for it by just getting rid of a few thousand civil servants. They've not made any changes to their overall spending plan. So implicitly, that money is coming from somewhere else. It was already the case that what we call unprotected areas, your budgets like local government, like prisons, like further education colleges, those areas were already facing cuts over the next Parliament. Those cuts will now be bigger, on something like maybe 2/3 the scale of those imposed during the peak austerity years of the 2010s. Ooh. So that's a really challenging period on the horizon for those other services. And this extra money for defence is going to add to that. Right, well, you've implied that it would be difficult to make the savings, let's put it that way, from getting rid of a few thousand civil servants. We talked yesterday about the end of the peace dividend, the amount that was being spent on health compared to defence at the end of the Cold War, sort of overtook, so much more has been spent on health. Is it possible to have both a large welfare state and a large warfare state? Not without difficult choices. I think this is going to be a moment where, for the first time in a long time, we're going to be spending more on health as the population ages and more on defence as the international situation deteriorates. And that's something we haven't had to grapple with for a long time. And I think the two options really, fundamentally, are one, we raise taxes, or two, we decide that the government is going to do less of other things. We have to not just seek efficiency savings here and there, but fundamentally ask, what is it the state currently does that we're going to stop doing and therefore make significant savings?
Right.
Or you raise taxes. There's no way to fiddle your way through this with painless sounding press releases.
Ben, stay with us. What are you going to do, Andrew? Which is it?
Well,
Raising taxes, which we hear repeatedly from Conservatives you don't like doing, despite having done it numerously.
Oh, we've cut taxes recently.
Well, yeah, recently, but up until now, it'll still be a big tax-raising parliament. Or do less? What are you going to do less of?
Well, we're not going to do anything less. The announcement that the Prime Minister made just yesterday, a very positive announcement. I think the British people need to know that we are serious about investing in the defence of this country and investing in our armed forces. It's fully costed. And yes, will come from the investment of the R&D budget into defence and also the cutting of waste and indeed the slashing of
We've
numbers
just
of civil
heard that
service
that's
to
not
pre-COVID
We've
levels.
just heard. What people will also want to know is how it's being paid for, and that is a legitimate question about where it's going to come from. We've just heard from Ben Zaranko at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, cutting the civil service a bit isn't going to cover it, and nor will any of the fiddling around the edges, to use his words. So fundamentally, if you want to increase spending, which isn't going to be by £75 billion in the next 6 years, what are you going to do less of?
We are committed to spending 2.5% of the UK's GDP on defence by 20... We are absolutely committed to doing that.
Yes.
The plan announced yesterday, as I said, was fully costed. And it's not just fiddling around the edges. We are slashing the numbers of civil servants to pre-COVID levels. The civil service, ballooned for obvious reasons.
How much does that raise?
During COVID. Well, millions of pounds, Joe. And we're also, the R&D budget within the MOD is being invested in as well. So, a combination of those things amount to the amount of money that was announced yesterday by the Prime Minister. And I think we should just all welcome what is an incredibly positive announcement, not just for ourselves here in the UK, but also for our allies around the world and indeed the people and government of Ukraine.
Is Labour going to commit to this? Spending 2.5% of our national income by 2030?
So we do want to get to 2.5%, but we want to take this seriously. And this is where actually policies that are made up, in a couple of days to put in a press release just are not going to cut it. We've said for many months that we need to have, if Labour is given that privilege of entering government, a strategic defence spending review. We need that to be a thorough review. We need it to occur as well with a spending review, again, if Labour is given that chance to serve in government. And this does need to have a really serious focus, because these are incredibly important questions. And just suggesting that you can wire money suddenly, as I say, just as it seems kind of after a few days' work from one source to another to deal with this, that's not good enough. We need a serious focus on it. We do need to be getting a grip on waste, because actually the Conservative-led governments over the last few years have wasted by, pretty conservative estimates, about £15 billion when it comes to defence procurement that hasn't been dealt with properly. But we need to have a proper plan to get us there. And I'm afraid what we saw recently is not that proper, detailed plan that we need in order to get to 2.5%, which is what Labour wants to get to.
Look, I dispute that, and I think we have to take with a pinch of salt any suggestion from the Labour Party that they are serious about defence and serious about investing the money required to ensure that we have the defences necessary and are investing in our armed forces and indeed supporting our allies around the world. This is the Labour Party that had Jeremy Corbyn as leader, that Annalise Yu and Keir Starmer campaigned, a man that wanted to disband the army. He voted against the renewal of Trident. It would take us out of NATO. How on earth can we believe
judge us
that the
on
Labour
our record?
Party...
We've seen
we
under
will
Conservative-led...
You tried to get Jeremy Corbyn into 10 Downing Street.
Conservative-led governments, we've seen the number of troops going down. The way in which our armed forces are treated, frankly, by this government, in terms of, for example, armed forces housing, is
I served in the armed forces.
appalling.
I served in the armed forces when Labour were last in power, and I tell you that armed forces today are served a hell of a lot better under this Conservative government than they ever were under the Labour government.
Ben, I want to bring up a new spending commitment from Labour, which has come out today, because the party is promising an extra 13,000 police and community support officers on the street streets to tackle antisocial behaviour and crime. Now, they say it'll be paid for through savings, such as tackling waste. You've heard a little bit from Annalise Dodds there in the procurement system. What do you make of that?
I think it's always good to tackle waste, and we should always be seeking to have more efficient public services. I think it also falls into this same bucket of both major parties announcing new shiny policies and then promising to pay for it through efficiency savings. Now, maybe they'll materialise, maybe they won't, but I think there's a danger of this being seen as wishful thinking and a refusal to reckon with the actual trade-offs that will await whoever wins the election when they come to a spending review and all of these promises meet the reality.
13,000 more officers. How much will that cost?
So that would cost about 370 million. That's about half of what the Independent Police Foundation have estimated could be released through the kind of savings that it's really important we make. And, I would agree, if there wasn't evidence that efficiencies could be produced, then this would be problematic. But just one really clear example of this, right? If you're in Leicestershire, then a police baton, a basic baton, would cost the force £20. You could even cross the street into Northamptonshire, it costs £120.
All
Now,
right.
to say there aren't savings there to be released, I'm afraid is just not right.
Very quickly, let's hear from Rishi Sunak from that press conference, being asked precisely these questions about how he will fund the defence spending commitment that he's made.
The plan that I announced yesterday is fully funded, and it's funded rightly with a reduction in civil service headcount back to 2019 levels. Since then, we've seen a very significant rise that isn't sustainable or needed. The Chancellor has conducted a detailed exercise. He announced this at the end of last year. That exercise is completed, and that's what gives us the confidence that we can release the savings needed to fund our defence plan, combined with an uplift in R&D spending, which we had already budgeted for, is already included in our plans. But you're right, we are making a choice to prioritise defence with both of those decisions, and I believe that's the right thing to do.
It is interesting how times have changed, isn't it? As you said, this was a former Chancellor, now Prime Minister, talking about spending much more on defence.
Yeah, and he talked about priorities there as well. We're heading towards an election whenever it comes. A lot of Conservative MPs want Rishi Sunak to go into that election promising tax cuts. How does that match up with this?
Oh, we'll be talking about it endlessly until the election. Ben Zaranko, thank you very much, and thank you to my other guests for joining me today. It's all we have time for, but I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live. Bye-bye.
I will be representing the UK at the Eurovision Song